How sweet are thy words unto my taste, yea, sweeter than honey to my mouth. Through thy precepts I get understanding, therefore I hate every false way. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet, and a light unto my path.
Because all flesh is as grass, and all the glory of man as the flower of the grass. The grass withers, and the flower falls away, but the word of the Lord endures forever. Now this is the word which by the gospel was preached to you.
In Acts chapter 14 and verse 23, we have the Apostle Paul and Barnabas who are bringing that first missionary journey to a close. And we discover here that they are coming back through the cities where they have established churches from Derbe to Lystra, Iconium, and into Antioch. And on this journey back, they are strengthening the brethren and they are ordaining elders in every church. Now, when we put that in a time frame, that's going to be about 10 to 15 years, give or take, after the establishment of the church. So we see that already by that time, elders, the office of elders, is in the church. But if we go back a few chapters to chapter 11, there we see, beginning at about verse 27, there is the prophecy of a famine in the land, and the church at Antioch has purpose to send a relief to the churches in Judea, and they do that by the hands of Paul and Barnabas. If commentators and scholars are correct in assuming that this is the famine that is mentioned by Josephus in the time of Claudius, that would be about the year 44. So that's going to put us again right there at about 10 years. But when we observe this text, I want to consider something. Luke does not take time to explain this is what an eldership is. This is the role of elders. Here's their authority. It is already established and understood. Not only that, Paul and Barnabas do not come in and say, we have relief from the church at Antioch. To whom do we need to give this that it might be distributed? They go to the elders of the church, which would indicate that the office of elders has been a few years before already established. That puts us about 5 years after the establishment of the church. Now, what's the purpose of all this? The importance of elders in the local congregation. And we see this especially when we come to Acts chapter 20 and verse 28, where the Apostle Paul, meeting with the elders from the church at Ephesus to strengthen them and encourage them and to warn them, says, take heed unto yourselves and to all the flock over the which the Holy Spirit hath made you overseers, to feed the church of God, which he hath purchased with his own blood. I'm Ronnie Scherfus, one of the instructors at the Texas School of Preaching, and I want to welcome you to Biblical Christianity Podcast. With me today, the director of the school, Brother Terrence Brownlow Dindy, and then also one of my fellow instructors, Brother Mornay Stephanus. Brother Terrence, I want us to consider in our study today 4 particulars from Acts chapter 20 and verse 28, where Paul says, take heed. And that Greek term could also be translated give attention to. And the 4 particulars here that from verse 28 through 32, that Paul admonishes the elders to give attention to. The first one is attention to self. The second one to the members, to the flock. Then he's going to mention grievous wolves, so false teachers that are without. And then some of them own selves, and so false brethren that rise up. Now, you're a gospel preacher, been preaching the gospel for a number of years, not only the director of the school here, but you also serve as an elder of the church here at BCS. Expound on this idea of elders giving attention to themselves.
Yeah, for sure. Anytime that God would select a man for a particular role of leadership, this is going to be a man of upstanding character. This is going to be a man who meets qualifications God himself has set forth. Something that we look at in the church is at times, sometimes we maybe missed a mark where this is concerned in selecting men that don't quite meet the qualifications in hopes of them meeting the qualifications eventually when they get into this leadership position. That's never the way that God has done it. He's always looked for men who've had the qualifications first and then placed them into these particular positions of leadership. And once he's in that position, there's an imperative for him to continue to tend to his own behavior. The Bible is very, very specific on what we ought to be thinking about, what we ought to be doing with our mental space. The Bible's very serious about how we ought to be speaking, what things ought to come out of our mouths. The Bible is very serious about the behavior that we engage in as citizens of the kingdom of heaven. And so as an elder of the flock, it's a very serious matter that not only do we meet qualifications initially to be able to assume the position, but that we also continue to make sure that we maintain the character and the behavior patterns and the mindsets that God would have us to look. We're going to be watching over the souls of others. We're going to be feeding, as you see in this very text, others of the flock. And so it's definitely, again, imperative that we make sure that we ourselves are practicing what we're preaching, that we are also meeting the same specifications and conditions that we have a charge from the Holy Spirit and through the Bible to be holding others to.
Something that, just to add to what you're saying here in 1 Peter chapter 5, the Apostle Peter, who himself was an elder of the Lord's church, he notes there in that chapter, he notes in verse 3, neither being as lords over God's heritage, but being examples to the flock. And so to keep our lives pure so that they could be examples to the flock, and also not to abuse their authority. In verse 4, when the chief shepherd shall appear, that they would receive a crown of glory that fadeth not away. But in verse 2, he says, he speaks of, or verse 3, of not lording over the heritage. And so there you see that they give attention to themselves, that they keep themselves pure, that their example will be good, and also their attitude of shepherding and overseeing the flock. Brother Mornay, when we look back at Acts chapter 20, it strikes me, just continuing on this thought of the elders seeing to themselves and paying attention to themselves. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, the Apostle Paul notes how that it was foolish for someone to talk about themselves, and he tries to refrain from using himself as an example. But in that occasion, he did, and he said, I speak as a fool. But whenever I look in Acts chapter 20, starting from about verse 17, as Paul is talking to the elders, he does nothing but talk about himself. But the purpose there is he's talking about, look at me for an example, as I was when I was among you. He was among them for about 3 years. Let's consider Paul's example that he set before them as a gospel preacher and as an apostle when he worked among them in Ephesus.
Yeah, we mentioned this in the last episode that we did about the really difficulty of gauging oneself or introspection. You know, we don't look at ourselves in a gauging manner very often. We don't introspect. We don't necessarily inspect our own lives, but we are told to do so. And that commandment is heightened for the elders because this is, as you already mentioned, it's a position of authority where they are going to be over the Lord's body, over the local body. And so it is a position of authority, and it's not perceived authority, it's actual authority. God has placed these men in charge of his flock, but also it's a position of honor, it's a position of acclamation. Because of the authority that is vested in it, because they were in charge of the master's children, they were in charge of the entire household, you know, as far as stewards are concerned, the master's household, they were in charge of the master's finances, stewards were, they were in charge of the goods and services. That's all relating to the church. And so it's a position of acclamation. It's a very important, it's an honorable position, and it's something that should be looked at. Now, in relation to when you think about accountability, and we think about the idea of take heed to yourself, that falls in the realm of accountability. You need to be accountable to God first. First and foremost, you are accountable for yourself, for what you have done. And so the Apostle Paul encourages them to take a look at yourself, to look inward, to look at what you are doing, and that accountability really has to be free from a false humility. You know, there's a false humility where people are like, well, I don't want to talk about myself, or, you know, I don't want to, no, you have to, as Ronnie just said, you have to look at yourself, and you have to be able to step back and say, listen, what am I doing? That's right. What am I doing that is right? What am I doing that is wrong? You know, without a false humility, the Apostle Paul here rightly points to himself as an apostle. He points to himself as a gospel preacher, and he says, I want you to look at me as an example of godliness. And what's beautiful about that is the Apostle Paul had no compunction about saying that. He could tell them, I want you to look at me as an example. Why? Because that's how he lived. And the first thing that we then take away from the Apostle Paul in that aspect, as you just brought up, is this. we should be able to say that. Elders should be able to tell the flock the same thing. Just what the Apostle Paul told them, they should be able to tell the flock, I want you guys to look at us as examples and to be able to say that confidently.
And that's not the only time Paul did that. 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse one, right into the Corinthians, be ye followers, imitators of me, even as I also am of Christ. Just to kind of wrap up this thought here with the elders and paying attention to themselves. In verse 18 of verse 18 of Acts chapter 20, he speaks of what manner I have been with you all seasons. Then he speaks humility of mind. Brother Mornay, you mentioned humility. Well, that humility of mind, that lowliness of mind. In addition to that, in verse 20, he says he kept nothing back. And then verse 27, he qualifies that all the counsel of God. So these elders, hey, not just shepherds, not just taking oversight, you also are teachers. You also need to be preaching the truth. And in verse 20, Paul talks about doing that publicly and privately. And so take me for an example. Paul certainly paid attention to himself. He said that 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he made sure that he was not cast away. And so elders also need to be sure they pay attention first and foremost to themselves because, as you said, Brother Mornay, accountable to God.
Sir, Brother Ronnie, if you think about Titus chapter 1, which also speaks to the eldership pretty extensively, where the qualifications are concerned, one of the last things on that list will be that these need to be men who are holding fast the faithful word that they have been taught, that they may be able by sound doctrine both to exhort and to convict the gainsayers. And so as an elder, you are about the business of commending and exhorting those who in the body of Christ are doing things the way that Christ would have them to, patting people on the back, giving the attaboys, making sure we give the charge for people to continue on in their faithfulness, but also at the same time having to rebuke those who are contradicting the faith. And again, both of those things would cause this man to take seriously the fact that he's got to be looking at himself, making sure that he himself is that example of those who are doing what is right and also just, again, living really an impeccable life. The Bible didn't say sinless. We all sin. We know that. 1 John chapter 1, verses 8 and 10. But living a life that is above reproach, to look at some of the qualifications that the Lord himself gives in the scriptures because of the fact that he's going to be constantly trying to influence, whether it be exhorting, whether it be admonishing or rebuking or approving that flock over which he's an overseer.
You know, it's not an exact parallel, Paul's admonitions to Timothy, to be an example of the believers. But elders also need to take that to great heart because they are the leaders of the congregation, having the oversight of the congregation, need to hold not only holding fast the sound word, but also holding themselves up before the brethren.
Yeah, well, Brother Ronnie, when you think about the concept of the eldership and taking heed to themselves, and that's as the Apostle Paul puts it on them to be able to take heed to themselves. They look at it and they have to look at themselves. But I think there's something to be said for congregations and for evangelists that are going to be ordaining elders. They have to be fit for the task first and foremost. A steward must be fit for the task. Luke chapter 16, verses 1 and 2. And especially in verse 2, as the Lord recounts, he says, so he called these stewards together, and it says, what is this that I hear about you? Give an account of your stewardship. Notice what he says, for you can no longer be a steward, right? You can no longer be a steward. Why? Because you don't meet the qualifications of being a steward. So when we're talking about taking heed to themselves, it's not only them understanding the grand responsibility of being an elder, but also honestly answering the question whether they are fit for the task. Whether they are fit for the task that that they are supposed to do, because there are men in society, not in society necessarily, but in the church that they are fit for the task, but they don't want to do it. But then there are men who are not fit for the task, and they do want to do it, and that just comes back to you're not taking heed unto yourself. You're not seriously and honestly examining yourself to know whether or not you fit the description that God has given and the qualifications that God has given. I think that is important to point out if we start looking at elderships from the very beginning. It starts in the heart of the man to want to be what God would have him to be and to have the honesty to say, you know what, I'm not qualified for this position. I can't serve.
You go to Luke chapter 16 and you note the steward there, and he was going to have to give an account of himself. He would not be a steward. Well, he obviously knew he had been engaged in improper handling of his master's affairs. Well, elders also, and this should cause a man who serves as an elder of the Lord's church to take note. Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 17, they will give an account for their work as elders. And very serious work, a very important work, and it must begin with them paying attention to themselves. Let's move forward here. And Paul next says, in addition to take heed therefore to yourselves, also he says, to all the flock over the which the Holy Spirit hath made you overseers, given you this oversight. And so members. Now, whenever we think about the flock, obviously this is the flock of God, which is in and of itself should cause a man to give serious consideration to his work. But my mind goes to Luke chapter 15, and there we have the parables of the lost. And the first of those parables, the parables of the lost sheep. And we think about members and sometimes how that members stray, and there might be various reasons that they stray. Here in that particular parable, and considering that particular sheep, it could sometimes brethren stray away because of carelessness. Sometimes maybe they're lured away. James chapter 1 and verse 14. That's how the adversary comes at us, by luring us away. Let's consider, Brother Terrence, some ways that sheep, that members might find themselves moved away and in need of the elders and that work of the shepherds.
Sure. Unfortunately, those areas are plentiful. Plenteous, maybe is a better way to say that. Devil does his work well. And we look in places like the book of 1 Peter chapter 5, verse number 8, still says what it says, that we need to be sober, be vigilant, for our adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about, seeking whom he may devour. He never stops. He never gets tired. He's very good at what he does. And so we look at the sheep of the congregation, and obviously when you look at that demographic within each individual congregation, you're going to have people that are at different levels of their spirituality, different levels of their spiritual maturity. There are going to be some that are more susceptible to the wiles of the devil, and there are going to be those who are very vulnerable to become prey. Obviously, all of us have to take heed and make sure we're watching ourselves, but that's an elder's job, is to be able to know that. The Bible says, take heed to the flock. Man, I've got to, as an elder, be able to know who is strong, who is weak, who is mature, who lacks maturity. In the Lord's body, I need to be familiar with the activities they're engaged in. It's a fine line. Sometimes people say, well, people don't like you in their business, and that's just kind of the way that it is. But whether people like it or not, God has given elders a responsibility to be able to know the flock, to take heed to them, to be mindful of them. And that means knowing who they are, knowing what they're engaged in. Again, we're not micromanaging their lives. We're not private detectives or police officers, but we are shepherds. The Lord uses exactly the analogy that he wanted to use. We're shepherds looking after their souls and trying to lead them down paths of righteousness in the way that God would have us to. And so again, we understand that, especially when a congregation is striving to be what God would have it to be, in doctrinal soundness and in love and in purity and in faithfulness and things like this. Those are the congregations that Satan is really gunning for. Let's face it, there's some congregations that Satan's already got wrapped up. Got them wrapped up already. He no longer needs to focus on them because he's got them. It's the ones that are striving after righteousness that Satan is going to be after. And again, he's got so many different ways to distract people. I just think about very practically some of the things that we deal with, man. People that elevate sports over their spirituality, over God and their devotion to God, that's a problem. And it's been a problem in the Lord's church as long as I've been alive. It's a problem. And so those things we have to worry about. Recreation, we live in an entertainment-driven society. And sometimes people elevate their recreation over worship and things like that. Vices, like we talked about on a previous episode. So many vices are out there. That's what the world is constantly promoting. And even men in the church now begin to promote so many vices. And people are favoring those things over their faithfulness to God. So many things we can look at. Family, whether it be positive or negative, family problems. Uh, Man, Satan is gunning for us. And so we have to be ever vigilant of what is going on within the flock and trying to make sure that we keep the sheep protected from Satan and his wiles and his devices.
Now, a point that you made there, knowing the spiritual maturity as elders, and being aware of the spiritual maturity, the level of the members of the flock of the church that where you have the oversight there. That's very important to note, and it ties in exactly with what Paul says here, to take heed or to give attention to. That's part of the giving attention to, is knowing the flock.
Yep.
Because when we know the flock, there may be some that need special attention. There are some who may be more easily led away. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 1 talks about those that are overtaken in a fault. Titus chapter 1 verse 11 speaks of those who come in and subvert whole houses. And 2 Timothy 3:6 speaks of silly women that are led away, the idea they're being gullible. And so knowing the brethren, their maturity level, maybe their personality, helps the eldership, helps those shepherds to be able to shepherd that flock better.
Absolutely. When we talk to our students here at the preaching school, one of the things I like to talk to them about in the preacher and his work, and I'm sure you guys do this as well, is preaching with purpose, right? Preaching with purpose. Well, you're getting up into the pulpit on Sunday morning. What are you preaching? But why are you preaching it, right? Are you just preaching it because that's next on the list? Or have your elders perhaps said, listen, I need you to cover this subject over here. I need you to talk about this. Or have you, if you do not have any elders, have you made use of the ministry and become all things to all men, where you went to go out and visit and you know the brethren, and so you know there are certain things that need to be addressed because you're paying attention, right? That's just you as a gospel preacher. How much more as an elder? How are you going to feed the flock if you don't know the flock? Right? You're wondering, well, why is this one over here, the sheep, not eating? Right? But is the sheep sick? Is there something wrong? How would you know that unless you're amidst the sheep, unless you are actively involved with the sheep? And so I think sometimes what happens in the Lord's church, generally speaking, is we have elders that are put on this throne, if you will, separate from the people, and they rule from that throne. They never mingle, never necessarily get involved with the members, and then they wonder why the congregations are in the shape that they are. Well, it's because you're not shepherding. Sure. You don't understand the concept that you are supposed to be involved in the members' lives, in the flock's lives, like Terrence said, not to police, not to be a police in there or a private detective, but for the sole purpose of making sure that the flock is healthy and well taken care of.
I like what you said there about the elders being involved and visiting generally at the local level, who's generally the one who's making the visits to the brethren, to those who are sick, to those who are weak, to those who are downtrodden and discouraged. Someone may say, our elders are approachable. Well, that's good, but elders need to be approaching, not just approachable. Sure. They need to be proactive, and they need to be involved among those brethren. The work of elders, feeding the flock, being sure they're spiritually fed, protecting, and also guiding. You can't do that if you're not aware of the brethren.
And that's it. Brother, I heard this one time with my own ears, true story. We don't tell stories that are not true. Working with Eldership a number of years ago, and just overhearing them talk about the accessibility of the congregation to them, and heard one of them, I'm standing right there in the middle of the conversation, and heard one of them say with my own ears that these people can't just come to my house anytime they want to. In other words, he's saying their accessibility, to me is very limited. All right. And so, I got things going on too important. I can't be disturbed. Here's my simple thoughts there, man. Get out of the eldership. Man, if you don't have time for sheep, if you don't like sheep, if you don't want to be bothered with sheep, you don't fool with sheep, then find something else to do. Because as you've already mentioned, Brother Ronnie, from Hebrews chapter 13 and verse number 17, we are going to give an account for the souls, those very precious souls that we oversee. And if I don't want to take this thing seriously, don't want to be bothered with it, then do myself a favor, my soul a favor on the judgment, get out of the eldership. And I don't have to be an elder in order to go to heaven, but I've got to be a good elder if I'm going to be an elder in order to go to heven.
You're talking about accessibility And men who are elders, it should be a door open. It should be a 24/7. You need me. Here's my number. Here's my address. You can contact me, whatever the need. And they serve, elders serve as shepherds under who? The chief shepherd. Find me one time in the life of Christ where he says, I'm not accessible.
Yeah.
Don't let it. Whenever the apostles would say, let's don't, and would try to keep some away from Christ, he would say, let them come. Just bring them on.
That's right. Even in times where he was trying to get a little bit of much needed reprieve.
Yeah.
Man, he was still accessible to everybody, man. People wouldn't give him a break. And even his own apostles, we think about when he's in that ship and he's down trying to get a little rest, get a little nap, man, and the tempestuous storm rises and he's waking up by them. They go down and wake him up. And so he doesn't say, hey, leave me alone. I'm trying to get some rest. He gets up, he goes, calms the storm with a word, and then rebukes them because of their little faith. But he is accessible and ready at their beck and call. And again, look, elders need rest like anybody else. But I try to keep my cell phone beside my bed to where I can hear it. Somebody rings my phone at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. We've had that happen. And say, hey, we need you right now. I look over at my wife, wake her up. Hey, somebody needs me. Get dressed and get ready to go. I've gotten phone calls. Brother Ronnie at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, people frantic. My family member just got in a car accident, or in this case, it was a motorcycle accident. Husband and wife on a motorcycle, wife's dead. Husband's in a coma, doesn't even know his wife is dead yet. We got to rush to the hospital and be with the family and try to comfort them and try to calm the hysteria in those situations. And so got to be ready to serve sheep.
Yeah, Brother Ronnie, let me just come in there because 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 3 really speaks to this very principle where he talks about not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but gentle. The word gentle there, equitable, fair, the concept of being gentle, patient, and reasonable. It's a beautiful characteristic when you think about elders and we think about the work that they do. Sometimes what happens in the body is we separate the spiritual nature of the work, and elders become glorified janitors, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're the ones who take care of the budget. They're the ones who mow the lawn and make sure the lights stay on, right? And that's all they do, and they forget their work is spiritual, right? And so what Terrence is talking about, the illustration he made is where someone is in need of comfort, who's going to provide that? When someone is sick, I believe somewhere it says something about calling your elders, right? And that's the idea. But rightly, Brother Ronnie, you mentioned about who does this right now most of the time. The local guy, anyone who's been preaching for a while, and we teach this to our students, most of the time this is going to happen. You're going to be the one who gets those calls. We've gotten those calls in the middle of the night. We've been at the hospital bed. We've been, taking care of individuals that needed care. And that's good to do. And as a preacher, I think you should do those things. But so many times what happens is that the elders take a back seat to that, when in reality, they are the shepherds. If anyone is going to be called, they should be called first to console the people and to comfort the people, because that's how God has set his sheep up.
I like how this discussion and this study has brought this to the practical aspect of the work of the shepherds. Because generally, whenever someone thinks about the work of the elders, it all has to do with withdrawing fellowship, and the practical aspect of things. When people are hurting, the shepherds need to be there. When people are rejoicing, the shepherds need to be there. When people are discouraged and struggling, that's part of the work of the elders. The great importance of the work of the shepherds of the flock of the local congregations cannot be overemphasized. Mm-hmm. And there are too many churches of Christ today that do not have elders to oversee them. Men either are not qualified or men are not willing to serve. Mm-hmm. And our prayer is that more men will qualify themselves, get themselves ready for the work. And brethren will search out and encourage those men to be elders of the Lord's church. Well, our time is up, and we appreciate you joining us for Biblical Christianity podcast. We look forward to our next study together.